We generally recommend to set 2 to 3 content pillars that you want to be known for. So for me, for example, marketing analytics, creative strategy, and then omni-channel marketing execution or budgeting, right? So those 3 things, not talking about a ton of stuff, but just 3 main things that we want to be known for. And within that, you can create a lot of subtopics that you would go after. And one really strong thing you can do, and it takes time to slow down, to speed up and figure it out, but is build a narrative conflict around your topic. So for example, there's somebody, his name is Barry Hott. He's very popular in the D2C space. He says something called ugly ads. And his whole thing is that lo-fi ugly ads outperform high production ads. He is known for that. So he's angled himself against strict brand guidelines and high-end production to be a proponent of something that everybody can produce. If you can angle yourself against an enemy and then have the solution that solves that problem, you'll also be able to resonate with a lot of people that also face that same thing.
Colby, pumped to have you on the podcast today. A little bit different than some of the other episodes that we've run previously. Colby runs BrighterClick, which is a top of funnel agency. So really excited to learn both about your business today, but also the clients that you've really helped increase their top of funnel acquisition. So without further ado, Colby, pumped to have you on.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on today. This is going to be a great chat.
Cool. So let's start from the beginning. I was doing some research on BrighterClick. And it's pretty interesting the way that you started, right? So like you were kind of doing your own thing, independent consulting with businesses, kind of building up your expertise and book of business. So I'd love to learn about, kind of those early days of specifically when you transitioned from doing your own thing to when you were like, look, this is really an opportunity. I got to build a business around this. I got to bring in some other people. And so maybe we could start there, like that transition from sole operator to building out BrighterClick.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm in a community of agency owners, and there's a lot of people that have made this transition as well. So I know it's a common one. I started out freelancing and kind of fell into the trap early on of taking on anything and everything. So newsletters and organic social and paid social and all of that, and really started to niche down to paid social 2016, 17, and started to scale that out. For me, when that transition started, it was because I'd really tapped into a good lead source and had a consistent flow or a consistent pipeline of new customers coming in. And I had to start turning down projects or just continue to raise my prices to kind of stabilize things, and realized that I didn't always want to be the sole operator or person that was pulling all the levers. So I started to build out team from there in 2019. Formed the agency, formed the LLC at the time, and started to kind of grow things from there.
That's awesome. So, speaking more specifically about kind of that inflection point, right? Like what was the niche that you found and what was the niche that kind of started to accelerate the business?
Yeah. So I niched down at the time to software companies, mainly product-led software companies. And I can kind of explain the reason for that later. And then e-commerce companies. And within that, I really focused on acquisition, more kind of narrow Facebook ads at the time, and then eventually expanded out to Google and LinkedIn, as much as I despise LinkedIn ads, but they're needed for software sometimes. So really focused on the vertical or the industry, and then also the service that we were delivering as well.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about SaaS, right? Because First Touch, we're basically product-led PLG, which transitions over to sales-led growth once we've kind of gotten into a business and have some adoption across an organization. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about top of funnel in the SaaS industry in specific. So you mentioned paid, like what did that start to look like? What was kind of the early playbook that you created?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we really focus towards product-led growth or product-led companies with paid social because funnels are, I don't use the term a lot easier, but they're a lot easier than they are with sales-led growth because there's nothing really with MQL to SQL and making sure tracking is properly set up. And all of that is different from business to business as well. So we really focused on understanding how we could build out funnels for product-led companies. And all of that starts with voice of customer and competitor research, really voice of customer research, but competitor is important as well. What are the problems? What are the pain points that this business, this product is solving for people? And too often, I think as marketers, we can get hung up on trying to just come up with the good ideas or come up with a whole campaign when all the information that we need is resting in the hands of our customers. So figuring out how we can get in contact with them, tapping into the sales reps conversations or notes, actually calling or interviewing the customers that way. And that's how we really focused on driving growth early on, is just going to the basics and building out creatives and building out ads. Ads were a lot different back then. It was a lot more about targeting audiences and a lot of duplication, a lot of different things now, which is a lot simpler in 2025 for the media buying aspect. But without going on a 15-minute long tangent about ads, that's how we got started out there.
Cool. That's great. So, of course, PLG, like a lot more trackable, right? Kind of similar to e-commerce, right? You bring them into a funnel, they buy a product. You get someone to a website, they look at some products, they end up adding some to their cart, or maybe they check out. So, kind of going a little bit deeper on the PLG side, do you have any stories of like early on when you had maybe like that first kind of golden moment where you're like, wow, like we just solved a big challenge here. It worked really well. And like, this feels like the future of our business.
Yeah, we started working with a print on demand company, and they had just closed, I think it was 240 million in a series of funding. And 2 months later, we connected with them to start running their paid social in 6 key markets to help them grow. The United States being the first market that they really wanted to grow, but there was 5 others as well. And I don't think at the time, because it was really still early on in the agency, I realized how big of an opportunity it was. But looking back, the growth that we had with them over 4 years and the impact that we're able to create, so many learning opportunities from working with their team. We ended up expanding out to working alongside them for influencer marketing, which is really popular in B2B these days, UGC sourcing, and creative strategy as well. But we were able to help drive down their CAC in the key markets and help them continue to expand their product offering as well. So it was a great eye opener of how much I personally enjoyed working with software companies to help them grow that way.
So let's talk a little bit about that piece, because I think you're right. Like UGC today, social proof today, especially in the world of AI, where there's a lot of potentially inauthentic content that's being distributed at really high volumes. Like, what are your thoughts today on UGC and running like a really effective UGC strategy?
Yeah, it's the term UGC in itself is a little bit confusing because it's not always user generated content. We focus on making sure that we understand the customer, and I'm going to apologize if I sound like a broken record repeating that time and time again, but understanding the customer to the fact that we want to make sure that the variable of the creator that we choose for a company fits who we're trying to go after, because you can have the best UGC script, but if you have the wrong person presenting it, then it's not going to land. It's not going to hit well. We will generally see how we can start out with, at a bare minimum, 4 to 8 creators and give a division. So if we have 4 creators, we'll do 2 briefs, and 1 brief goes to 2, 1 brief goes to the other 2, etc. So we cut it in half that way so that we can test out variables of the creator and then the overall messaging angle as we go forward. Just like we treat creative strategy, so post-production content, graphics, and videos, we also do the same thing with UGC, which is we'll complete that voice of customer and competitor research. We'll understand what are the rational and emotional motivators, what are the core pain points or drivers that customers are talking about in reviews, on Reddit, on organic social, and then we'll order those in frequency ratio. And then we want to understand how are the main competitors and the brand we're working with angling themselves in their messaging, and what are the opportunities that are high frequency or high pain points for the customers that aren't getting addressed, or may be but aren't getting addressed correctly. And we'll create a 90-day testing strategy for creative with those core 4 to 6 messaging angles that we'll go after. And then our briefs going forward, whether it's UGC or post-production, are focused on testing out those messaging angles. One thing that we often try to push is that it can be very easy to get really narrow and defined in understanding like why one single ad performed well. And that is important, but to be able to drive success, it's good to take a step back and look at the 1,000-foot view and say like, this strategy or this messaging angle performed well with this type of creator, et cetera, et cetera. So that's generally how we start out with going for UGC, and then ultimately results kind of compound from there when we can start mashing stuff up as well.
So I would imagine like a lot of that success is determined by how good of a fit that creator is for the market, and who's following them, right? Who's engaging with their posts. Um, how do you go about identifying content creator fit?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and I will say UGC creator being like someone that makes content, doesn't necessarily have like a big social following. Influencership will be when we're activating like their YouTube channel or their Instagram channel that way. But we will look to understand the most we can for demographics from data, which is kind of like I don't want to say a blind analysis, but you can't really see the person, right? You can just get data that way. And then once again, we will talk with the customer that we're working with, our client. Ideally, they have a clear picture of who their target demographic is. So if we're talking SaaS, it's industry, it's job title, it's age, it's previous tenure experience, like those types of things that we're going after. And if the brand or the SaaS company that we're working with doesn't have that information, we do try to either talk with the sales reps or get on conversations or get on calls with the actual customers themselves so that we can get that fit that way.
I love that you guys go so deep with the customer, right? Because like it is so important to understand what the company is seeing, specifically the piece about talking to sales reps. Like, what are they seeing in the market? What type of positioning is resonating with the conversations that they're having? And those aren't always obvious to a business, right? And like I think there's a lot of effort being made right now to really consolidate that information, record all your meetings, record the transcriptions, keyword search out pieces so the product team can understand where things are deficient or where things could be improved. But I think like a lot of that also applies to advertising, right? So when you go into a business and they don't have a clear idea of these things, like is that typically a red flag to you of like, hey, this advertising strategy or top of funnel strategy might not work very well?
I would say it's a time to step back and say we need to first focus on figuring out their brand messaging. If they don't understand how they are positioning themselves in the market or what their product fit is, then we would. So normally we start by doing that research and then going straight into messaging angles. If that's the case, we would do that research and go into brand positioning strategy and testing, and then start to go into messaging angles for that brand positioning from there. So that's something that we would really just kind of add an additional step to make sure that the customer understands that we can't succeed if we just go straight into ads, because paid ads, no matter who's running them, are really just an amplifier of your business. So if your business doesn't understand your messaging and your overall positioning, then your customers aren't going to understand it through your ad creatives either. So it just adds an extra additional step to us. And I hate to say just, because it is a whole process, but
And I think that's something that like a lot of businesses struggle with, right? Like even ourselves included, right? We've gone through different iterations of how we explain our product and how we position our product in the market, dependent on different industries as well. And I think for a lot of companies, especially the folks that listen to this podcast, it's like they're typically transitioning from founder-led sales to a sales team. And through that process, like being able to orchestrate and communicate value of the brand to other people or to agencies or to the ad side of the business, like it's a big step. And typically those things happen in parallel. Do you typically see that there's a size of business or a maturity of a business where, ad and top of funnel works really well? Like, are there typically signals that you look for where you're like, man, this business looks like they're ready for advertising, or maybe a different business doesn't?
I think as long as they are not super bootstrapped, like I'll give you an example. I'm in the process of building a marketing analytics software. It's something we've done in our agency, and now we're going to take it to market. We are not going to run paid ads early on, but we're bootstrapping as of right now. That might change, and I'll let you know if it does, right? So it's not a time for us to. I think if the company has revenue flowing, and they have validated product and there's not product issues, then it's a great time to at least get started with paid ads. I mean, we're working with a SaaS company right now that is B2B, not B2C, product led. They're spending $2,000 to $3,000 a month on paid ads. Not a huge paid ad budget, right? But it's still bringing them leads that is coming in the door. The one thing that I will add to that, which is kind of a different pathway, and I know I keep sounding like a broken record with talk to your customer, but I just mentioned I'm building a software that way. We started doing ICP interviews. So just reaching out to marketing agency owners, asking if they get on a 30-minute call so we could ask them questions. I went into this software build with a very clear focus on like the problem we were going to solve and the messaging that we were going to go for. And it was fully operational focused. And my bias, even still today, even though I've done dozens of these interviews, still thinks that's the way we should go in the future. We'll see. But after all these interviews, that is one of the least concerns for a cohort that is like sub 25 headcount agency. It is client perception. It is overall value that they're providing their client and the visual presentation with their analytics software. It is not team operational efficiency and improving client headcount per team member that way. So we really had to reposition how we were going to go after that cohort sub 25 headcount business and change our messaging that way. So I don't know if that also helps answer that question, but I think just really focusing on being as close to the customer as possible helps be ready for ads as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I think it's something that, we have familiarity with too. We've spoken with, I don't know, it's got to be hundreds of sales leaders at this point. We have over 2,300 people using our technology and platform. And the messaging is constantly being updated and iterated and changed. And there's so many different personas, right? You've got sales reps that are actually using the platform, but then you've got the manager and director and VP, and each of them cares about different things, right? Even though the sales reps are the ones that are going to be in the platform all day, you really have to sell to a VP or director to be able to have top-down enablement of a new software to business. So I think that makes a ton of sense. I guess one thing that I'd be curious to like learn a little bit more about as well, right? Is like once you start iterating, right? And so you're working with the business, they're constantly improving their messaging. How does the ad strategy typically evolve over time? Like how do you use that data to make decisions about where ad spend should be generated by channel, by content type, et cetera?
Yeah. So if we're looking at messaging strategy, so if we need to do brand positioning, we would do that. And then we would go into overall messaging strategy. And then from there, of course, we're testing some different types of visual presentation, but we really start dialing in on how we can turn it into multiple types of different presentation or visual assets after we validated the messaging. So we would generally test in static form. CPMs are lower. You can get data faster. You can validate things. And then from there, that's when we generally try to graduate things to like UGC, influencer sourcing, higher production content, et cetera. That way, we will, I am very much in the camp of try to exhaust a channel or stretch it as far as you can before you start expanding to many channels, because then you need additional resources and additional oversight and a lot of stuff like that. But we will focus on going omni-channel if it makes sense for the business from a demand generation aspect. We're not as much in the camp of lead generation of like just getting forms filled out or things like that. I think that multi-touch really comes into play when there is some sort of hybrid model, kind of like you said with, your product led early on, and then you have sales that comes once the customer's already in. LinkedIn thought leadership ads and things like that are great as touch points for existing customers if you're trying to do cross sells, right? So we can really start to expand out to other platforms once we've validated what we know is working, at least for the time. But once again, messaging changes, and that can continue to go. We've worked with businesses, like I said, that had 240 million in funding, 300 plus headcount company, and they were still trying to figure out who their ICP was and what that target messaging looked like.
So you mentioned a really interesting strategy, and it's something that's become more popular in the last, 6 months now. But thought leadership posts and sponsoring those and getting them to, distributed on LinkedIn. Like, what does the LinkedIn playbook look like these days? Such heavy B2B SaaS. Obviously, there's a lot of go-to-market technology on LinkedIn. Like, what do you see in that channel? Is there anything that's kind of been surprising or interesting the way that things have evolved over the last half year?
Yeah, I think in 2025, two of the strategies that I'm seeing really frequently on LinkedIn, if you know what you're looking for, you'll see it as well, is B2B influencer paid posts, right? The B2B marketing market generally follows the B2C side with like a 2 to 3 year lag, right? So influencership was really popular in B2C, it still is. And now it's really rising. So if you see someone that does not work at a company that's talking about a product very prominently in a post, it's probably been paid for or at least enticed that way. So B2B influencership, think about Icon, which is an AI tool. That's all over the place right now. AppLovin was all over the place 4 or 5 months ago. And then they kind of fizzle out. Like people stop talking about them as much. So that's a big push. And then another big push right now, of course, founder led thought leadership is very prominent, especially for smaller companies that don't have a lot of team members. But team led creator content is really popular, especially in B2B companies. So people like doing business with people versus doing it with faceless corporations, right? So more and more companies, B2B and B2C, are really starting to encourage their team members to either make content on the B2B side or make thought leadership content on the B2B side and push that out there. And it's really beneficial for SaaS company owners or B2B company owners because it doesn't put all the weight on you and you don't have to be an expert at every piece of your business. So if you are a software company that sells to CFOs and you have a CFO, your CFO should be one of the primary people that is pushing stuff on LinkedIn to attract other CFOs and vice versa for, COOs or CROs or whatever the role is that way.
I think that's a great point. We're seeing that trend. We're pretty active on social. Again, I think a lot of folks in the go-to-market space are, particularly, and I get asked this question a lot from people, but like, hey, should I start building thought leadership on LinkedIn? And I think the piece you just mentioned is a really great way to answer that. It depends on the audience, right? And if you're selling to CFOs, like your CFO should be the one who's really leaning into content because that's the person who those folks are going to listen to. If it's a development focused company like the engineering team, even if they're not comfortable with it, should be the ones that are posting because their opinions are going to be the ones that are respected by the target audience. So in sales tech, it's pretty simple, right? You can have SDRs, AEs, your sales leader really kind of posting heavily. But I think that's a really great way of delineating where the focus should be for a company. Because the reality is if you're an SDR and you're selling to an engineering industry, your posts about engineering probably aren't going to be as well respected.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And some additional things that we'll do for that. A broken record again. You already know what I'm going to say. Customer interviews. Make sure you know what they're looking for, but also SEO keyword research. So understand what people are actively searching for. Right. If you have some sort of social listening tool, that can be beneficial as well for organic socials. And then we generally recommend to set 2 to 3 content pillars that you want to be known for. So for me, for example, marketing analytics, creative strategy, and then omni-channel marketing execution or budgeting, right? So those 3 things, not talking about a ton of stuff, but just 3 main things that we want to be known for. And within that, you can create a lot of subtopics that you would go after. And one really strong thing you can do, and it takes time to slow down, to speed up and figure it out, but is build a narrative conflict around your topic. So, for example, there's somebody, his name is Barry Hott. He's very popular in the D2C space. He says something called ugly ads. And his whole thing is that lo-fi, ugly ads outperform high production ads. He is known for that. So he's angled himself against strict brand guidelines and high-end production to be a proponent of something that everybody can produce. It could be, like I said earlier, we are very much on high-level messaging strategy versus narrowing down to really just spend all your time focusing on one ad. If you can angle yourself against an enemy and then have the solution that solves that problem, you'll also be able to resonate with a lot of people that also face that same thing.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? Creating that delineation, creating the pain point and demonstrating that you understand it and then being able to provide the solution. Very cool. So with that in mind, right? Like we're talking LinkedIn, we're talking ad spend. What are you seeing on the SEO side? So there's been a lot of chatter lately, right? A lot of LLMs have absorbed the search function, right? So Google is starting to lose market share around search function. LLMs haven't really opened up public advertising to be able to really push yourself into those channels. How are you kind of advising businesses on how to optimize for like new age search?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've seen people call it GEO versus SEO, which is like generative engine optimization. I believe, and I am not an LLM expert. I would like to be, but I'm not. So I do believe they are still pulling from search engines. I believe they're getting their content and prioritizing because we see on Google Analytics that we are getting referrals for traffic from ChatGPT, for example. And when I search or when I do a query on ChatGPT to try and trigger the same thing, it does a link and it links to that specific page, right? And as if it's the top of Google now when it does that type of linking that way. I think that it still is focusing on having patience and making good content. Backlinks are king or queen if you play chess. Backlinks are really what drive results, and making sure that you're getting quality backlinks from quality authoritative websites. Reddit has now taken over a share of the top three over Forbes, and Reddit is a prime opportunity for software companies, for any brand really, to get on there and to get their content seen and out into the public. Reddit is also very unfiltered and ruthless, so have tough skin if you are going to get into that realm. And just making sure that you are creating content that is relevant. That way, you can also get found on YouTube through search, and make sure that you make good video content that way. But I think that LinkedIn copywriting, LinkedIn organic is very good about calling everything dead when it gets a little bit harder to do. So I think it's gotten a little bit more difficult, but I don't believe that SEO is dead in 2025.
That's a great take. And I'm going to latch onto that one. So, Colby mentioned, right, Reddit. And a lot of businesses think about Reddit and they're like, look, I can't identify the people that are engaging with my posts. It's really hard to identify and understand who should I be reaching out to, right? It's not like an obvious lead generation platform, but it is a place where people look for social proof and a place where people look for content and things that are related to subjects that they're interested in. I actually am really strongly in agreement with you there that I think Reddit over the next couple of years is going to be a massive channel, but it's way harder to track than LinkedIn because you don't know who's engaging, right? It's way harder to track than email because you don't know who's engaging, but people are reading it and people are looking at it and they end up entering your sphere of influence in other ways. Are you talking with companies at all about like advertising on Reddit or like building out strategies on Reddit?
We have dabbled a bit in advertising for Reddit. We haven't done a ton. What I really am a proponent for at the current moment is organic engagement with Reddit, which obviously takes more time. It takes more buy-in. And I think Reddit falls into the category of strategies that take top-down buy-in on demand generation versus trackable lead generation that way. I interviewed wet shaving company owner on my podcast. They do $1 million a year in revenue. The only marketing strategy that he does is organic Reddit engagement in the wet shaving communities or in the shaving communities. I think it's very beneficial for software companies to, on the smaller side, so like sub $5-10 million annual revenue, to focus on finding communities that are relevant to what you're going after, the target audience that you're going after, and providing as much value as you can without asking for a lot. And then making sure that your profile has the links to your website and all that stuff so people can find you. I think as you start to get bigger in revenue, it's also very important for your company to create their own subreddit so that you can answer people's questions and engage with your audience. ClickUp has their own subreddit. There's many other softwares that have their own subreddit that people are highly active on. So I think Reddit is going to continue to grow. Their stock's been doing great over the last year. And one other note on an interview I did, it was with one of the moderators for Entrepreneur subreddit. He is doing a podcast and Reddit is currently paying for him to do that podcast, but it's getting broadcast on YouTube. He says he is under the understanding in the future, they're going to be moving that towards Reddit. And it's almost going to be like a streaming service or platform on there as well. So I think they have a lot of plans going forward to continue to build out their platform.
Yeah, very cool. So you'd say if you had to recommend to entrepreneurs that are maybe in the SaaS space right now, even though not wildly obvious, they should be investing in that channel?
100%.
Yep. Cool. All right. So we've covered Reddit, we've covered LinkedIn, we've covered a little bit of Facebook because you mentioned it earlier. Where do you think the focus should be? And I'll give you just a really simple example. Companies at like $1 million ARR, they're scaling relatively quickly. They've found some type of messaging market fit. Like, what do you think the next step looks like for a company like that, and where they should be spending their time?
There's going to be a lot of variables. So don't take this as an at all applied to everyone. AI is making software development a lot easier. It's lowering the barrier of entry to build a software company. Granted, it's not the best code. You still need to check it. It's not where it's going to be in 5 years, but it's a lot lower cost. So it means the competition could be a lot higher. If you think about the software companies that succeed in the past 5 years and will succeed in the next 5 years, they focus on building a brand. You don't ask people, do you use heat map tools? You say, do you use Hotjar? When you're asking someone what what project management tool they use, you generally ask them if they use a specific tool, not do you use project management software. The companies that focus on building a brand, building demand, building awareness are the ones that are really excelling in the SaaS sphere right now. And I think that that's a key priority so that you can angle yourself to be less receptive to downturns in the economic market and less receptive to downturns in SEO changing or the Facebook ad algorithm changing, because you have that awareness and demand. So I think building out a content strategy to entertain and to inform people is a strong play for any software company going forward.
I think, table stakes is having a good product, but I think you're totally right? AI is democratizing the ability to create software. And I think the businesses that win over the next 5, 10, 15 years are going to be the ones that get attention. And the best way to get attention is to create a content strategy around it and to be consistent with it. So I think that's a great takeaway. Colby, really appreciate the time today. It's been an awesome conversation. I've learned a lot. I think there's some good takeaways that we can apply to First Touch, and hope that the folks listening to have some good takeaways that maybe they can apply to their businesses.
Thanks for having me on. This was great.